I firstly congratulate my good friend, the member for Isle of Wight, for bringing forward this really important debate. Can I commend him and my right honourable friend, the Member of Parliament for Chipping Barnet, for the excellent work they've been doing over a significant amount of time. And most of that work was done behind closed doors as a critical friend. As a government loyalist like I am, it allowed me the space to contribute positively in a small way to actually making sure that this piece of legislation and the debate is exactly how we want it to be without being seen as disruptive or disloyal. As I've said before many times in this chamber, I come from a local government background. I was a councillor for 17 years prior to getting elected. Actually, a little bit of overlap because of the pandemic. And in all that time, I spent many years on planning committees. Most lastly, I was chairman of planning of a committee in Epping Forest, and I was a dual hatter, so I was a county councillor as well in Essex. And over my tenure as a county councillor, I was also responsible for strategic planning. In all those years in local government, I thought that local plans were better than their predecessors, the regional development agencies, which were very much a clunky model, top-down from Whitehall, being imposed on our communities. So while the local plan process remains quite emotive, and I would argue quite difficult, it's definitely part of the journey and part of the future legislation that we'll be seeing will help improve that process. Can I commend the government for listening to the constructive criticism and feedback that people like my good friend, Member of Parliament for Isle of Wight, put forward. Top-down numbers are helpful, but they shouldn't be a stick to beat local authorities with. The 5-year land supply, I'm happy to see that being removed. I always thought that was a bit of a tool for unscrupulous developers or applicants to use as a way of putting development in the wrong place. As a politician, and I think I speak on behalf of the whole House, we're always very, very self-conscious about unintended consequences. No politician of whatever party wants to put forward bad laws or policies. But that, for me, was one of those areas where actually, while we were trying to encourage councils to actually make sure they had the pipeline of future development, having a hard 5-year deadline meant that actually all of a sudden you open up a massive can of worms with unscrupulous developers from around the country getting involved and having those particular authorities, particularly being, I'm speaking about my own two authorities, being a bit under-resourced in terms of their planning department through no fault of their own, it did mean that they were in some ways swimming against the tide and finding it increasingly difficult. Now, my own constituency of South West Hertfordshire is a beautiful part of the world. We have the area outstanding natural beauty on the Chilterns to my west. I border London to the south, and yet we've got the best of all worlds where you are very good transport links into London, but yet you still retain the village feel. I'm about 80% greenbelt. That gives you a strong indication of that. Actually, wherever you look pretty much, you will see prime greenbelt or farmland or trees. And part of the joy of representing South West Hertfordshire is you're more likely to hear a bird waking up in the morning than cars. That's not to say we don't need further investment in transport, and I will continue to bang on, especially on the train network and the tube in the south. But it's a nice place to live, and as a Conservative with a small c, part of my role as the elected Member of Parliament is to actually retain what we like about and love about the community. The pressures that we're experiencing in the home counties and London, pre-pandemic I would argue, because of the draw for better paid jobs, has meant that we are continually having these debates on local planning issues. My plea to the Minister, and it's great to see her in a place, is actually the local plan process. Can we try and future-proof it post-pandemic? The way people live their lives and the draw of coming to the South East is and I would argue, a bit less or lesser, because actually you can perfectly reasonably have a very well-paid and a good job with future career prospects, but not necessarily move down to South West Hertfordshire or London. I know my generation, and I've got a lot of friends from the Midlands especially, that were drawn down to London, but I had a meeting as chair of the APPG for Regeneration and Development with Birmingham Council yesterday, and hearing the exciting plans they're doing in that part of the world, if I was an 18-year-old or 20-year-old from that part of the world now, I would not necessarily see the bright lights of London being the real draw, because you could still have a really good quality of life with reasonable house prices, with good quality of work-life balance, and actually quite a vibrant community with lots of future plans coming through. There was a poll done in my two councils back in 2020 that asked my residents to name their favourite thing about living in South West Hertfordshire. Both councils, and I represent half of Dacorum Borough Council and most of Three Rivers District Council, over 3/4 of those respondees across both council areas said it was the parks and open spaces. Post-pandemic, we've seen actually the silver lining in my eyes of the pandemic has been people have really appreciated what's been on their doorstep. As someone that still commutes into London every day, I know that I may be a rare breed at the moment, and a lot of people are still getting back to working full-time in their office space and have been perfectly set up now over the last couple of years to work from home. So avoiding the 2-hour commute there and back that I have to do most days is a natural draw. But it's not just the commute and the saving of the transport costs, but it's actually the quality of life aspect. Planning by its very nature should be focused on the health and well-being of communities. My role and my view actually as a Conservative councillor at the time was actually when we do planning badly, it's not just the eyesore of what it looks like, but actually the negative aspects of poor development means to unhealthy outcomes, which means actually a more additional burden to the state in future years to come. And as a Conservative, one of my values is actually offering value for money. So actually where we can reduce the cost burden for future generations, we should absolutely be proactively doing that. And I think planning and the way we do planning is very much part of that mix. Now, in terms of brownfields, apparently there's 1.2 million homes currently lying dormant in brownfield sites. I've referred earlier to the significant greenbelt aspect of my community. While there is always a draw to do what's easy, which is actually a piece of grassland, build on it, that doesn't mean it's necessarily the right thing to do. And the Honourable Member for the Isle of Wight spoke about the renewed emphasis on getting brownfield sites back into use and back into use is absolutely the right theme that I hope my government will continue to push, because some of the communities and the regeneration aspects of our communities are not necessarily to do with new homes, but actually the quality of what people see outside their windows when they're driving to the local shops. If you are next to a derelict site that doesn't look like anything's happened for 5-10 years, that does have a subconscious bearing on how you feel for the day. And yet, if you see loads of new development, while it's a real pain in the short term, having that brand new school or a new hospital or additional classroom space, these are things that people feel the benefit of, and that's what the planning process is meant to do. It's meant to make the next generation living in that area have an easier life than the previous generation. Strategic planning is absolutely required. We've had piecemeal planning. We see that occasionally via planning application appeals, and that inevitably does lead to a can of worms of actually the developments being in the wrong place. So while that may make a lot of money for the developer at the time, it does have a significant impact on especially local authorities trying to offer the support network, things like social services, or the NHS doing NHS nurses having to go to out-of-the-way places where actually those were absolutely the wrong sites to have that type of development. In South West Hertfordshire, from January last year, of January to September, Hertfordshire councils, there were about 12,000 applications received, of which 11,500 decisions were taken, and of that, 85% were granted. So I don't think the actual planning application process seems to be the issue or the bottleneck. While planning remains very complex, and it does need to be because there's a lot of expertise required within it, and I applaud the government's drive for digitisation because that means more people will actually engage in the process. There should be, and I don't know how we do it yet, there should be more motivation for actually doing the right thing. Putting an application in just to try and get increase in property value without actually developing it, I would argue that I know loved ones that have done the same. That may be helpful for their short term, but it does give a false economy on actually what is actually available or in the pipeline to be developed. in the south of my constituency, I've got 3 years district council, which is Liberal Democrat controlled, and for many years, since I've been elected, I've continued to push them to continue the momentum of trying to get a local plan in place, because I would argue, and I would say this as a Conservative Member of Parliament, they are probably using the change in the reforms we're looking to do in planning legislation as an excuse to actually not get on and do it. Decorum Council in the north of my constituency, which is Conservative controlled, and my very good friend, the Right Honourable Member for Hemel Hempstead, said this yesterday at P&Qs, is getting on with it. While it's difficult, it's the absolute right thing to do, and my plea to the Minister will be actually where we think councils are using this as an opportunity to do the wrong thing, whether it's a quiet word or threats of sanctions or whatever it may be. I don't know what tool she has in her armoury. We do need to encourage these councils to get on and do it, because sticking your head in the sand is not the solution for planning at all. We do need those mature and yes, typically emotive conversations, but we need those conversations to be had and actually decisions to be made. Politicians were elected to make decisions, even sometimes when they are difficult to make. The 11th Regen bill, I think, is actually in a very, very good place. There is still more to do, but I wouldn't expect it necessarily to happen in this particular piece of legislation, but I'm sure there's a future pipeline of future legislation coming through the Levelling Up department. I will now wrap up. In conclusion, there is a demand for housing in this country, which cannot and should not be ignored. My honourable friend from the Isle of Wight spoke about start times. That's a really big issue in my part of the world. And while people will remain emotive about new development, typically those new homes are for the local community. So when people are moving out of mum and dad's home, where they're going to live. And in my part of the world, that means they're going to move away to quite significant areas, quite significant distances away. Brownfield land is very much there. We do need to actually start proactively, even more so, getting them back into use. But the counter to that is some of the greenbelt land. I do think the government should encourage regular reviews of greenbelt, because there are various spectrums of what is greenbelt. You know, if it's prime arable land, absolutely we should retain it. But if it's edge of settlement that's been dilapidated for 20 years and has no health or environmental benefit, they're the ones we should be looking to identify to actually say, let's make better use of that site. I think with the right plan and the right policies in place, we can maximise the benefits of planning and keep our green spaces safe. Thank you very much.